Hi, and welcome to ECE Honestly with Kayla and Lisa. Here we discuss the ups and downs of working in the field of early childhood education. So listen, hopefully learn, and enjoy. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude that we live, work, and learn on the unceded and traditional territory of the Coast Salish, Quaquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo peoples. So on this week's episode, I have the honor of speaking to Morna Ballantyne. So, if I'm not mistaken, is the executive director of the Childcare Now, or the Childcare Advocacy Association of Canada. So,
That's right.
welcome.
Thank you.
So, Morna, tell us a little bit about yourself. What inspired you to be, if I'm not mistaken, you are an advocate for the Affordable Childcare Plan, which is essentially the same idea as the $10 but from a federal level as opposed to a provincial.
Yeah, so our organization was founded in 1982 and was then founded, it was actually at that time known as the Daycare Advocacy Association, and then had a name change and became the Childcare Advocacy Association for Canada. And then the last couple of years, we changed our name again to Childcare Now, in part just to reflect the urgency of the problem that needs to be solved, in our view, by government. And I got involved in advocating for changes in childcare about 36 years ago when I was pregnant with my first child.
Wow.
And it was only once I was pregnant that I realized that early learning and childcare, what we call early childhood education then, was not actually organized in my community or anywhere at that time the way the public education system is organized. I just sort of assumed when I was pregnant and had at that time only 17 weeks of maternity leave, parental leave didn't even exist then,
Wow.
that when it was time to go back for work, I would just sign up with a local authority and that I would get a childcare spot and that it would be free and really good quality and I could go back to work. And just found out that, of course, is not at all the case. And back then it was licensed childcare, especially for infants. And because I had to go back to work, after a very short maternity leave, I had a young infant to find care for, and it was just not available. And also incredibly expensive. I did, in the end, manage to get a spot in a licensed parent co-op.
Wow.
And really fortunate. But I realized that if more people didn't start speaking out and changing this, then nobody would be in this same situation I was in, which was an incredibly lucky situation of having high quality care, but extremely expensive. Even then, it was close to $1,000 a month, and that was a long time ago.
Wow. And this is amazing because speaking to Sharon the other day, she also mentioned how it's amazing, yet it's also very unfortunate that the stories very much run parallel. It's usually always a mother looking for care, needing care for her child, sort of going through this dilemma of, I need to work in order to provide for this new child that I've had, but I also don't have that security to know that they're going to be safe and taken care of. And now I'm in this panic, for lack of better words, to find that, so that I know that my child is safe, so that I can go to work, so that I can be a provider for them.
Yeah, exactly. And my story started 35 years ago. It's a story from 35, 36 years ago. But really, it's a story that goes way, way back, further than that. And, in fact, this very month, and in fact, it was last week, we sort of celebrated the 50th anniversary of the submission of the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And, this was a report that was, the Royal Commission was established then by the federal government to investigate the status of women. And one of the findings, of course, of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women is that women who are experiencing serious problems of economic security and equity.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the major factors contributing to that was the lack of access to affordable, high quality childcare. Mm-hmm. And at that time, 50 years ago, recommended the establishment of a Canada-wide system of early childcare education. And it's, if you go back to that report and look at the recommendation, as you were saying, and also the findings of the reports, you'll see that this has been the story for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically almost not really much has changed in those 50 years since this report was given.
I would say some has changed. I think there has been quite a bit of change, but the change that has happened is not being what we would call systemic change.
Right.
So there, in the last 50 years, governments have been forced to kind of put patches on the problem. A lot of Band-Aid solutions to the problem of the problems of affordability, problems of inclusion, problems of quality, access, and so forth. But really, they have been just Band-Aid solutions. And so, what we experienced through the pandemic, for example, was Band-Aids don't work.
Mm-hmm.
They really, what we really need is some big change, because if you don't have a system in place and a robust system in place, what you have instead is a lot of fragility. And during the pandemic, that fragility was just laid bare for everybody to see. Right.
So it's almost like it took, I know the one thing that I always said, especially when we were just at the height or beginning of this pandemic, was that it was really unfortunate how it literally took a forest fire, a dumpster fire, or just something so insane to happen in order for childcare to finally be deemed as necessary. And here in BC, for the premier to address us as essential workers, when we were never, like, I personally don't ever think I've ever read about this or heard about early childhood educators being deemed as essential. And yet we're still not taken as seriously, and we're not given that same level of respect. If we're going to pull out of this pandemic, be it, well, I would say more than anything, in terms of economics or economic recovery.
Yeah, it's interesting, because if you look at employment levels of women
Mm-hmm.
in the paid workforce, you can see that there's a dramatic increase in participation rates over the last 4 decades. It's really been one of the biggest changes, of course, of our economy and our economy, and also it's had an impact just about in everything. And then the large number of women who are actually in the paid labor force, but that big change in the economy has really been on the backs of women.
Yes.
That, the one thing that really has not changed in the last 50 years is the reliance on women, and particularly women's either free or very badly paid labor, to do the caring and education work of young children. Mm-hmm. and also of elderly family, the parents as well, of elderly family members. And that's when you look at increases in participation rate of women in the paid labor force, and you look at the increase in licensed childcare, the two don't go hand in hand. There's this big divergent gap between the two. And what that means is that large numbers of women, in fact, the vast majority of women who are in the paid labor force and have young children, are having to turn to informal, unregulated, inadequate, unreliable, unstable, and sometimes extremely dangerous and poor quality arrangements for the care of their children. You know, and the licensed childcare sector has also really functioned and survived, again, on the backs of the low wages of women. You know, it's a sector that employs almost exclusively women. It's a sector that is incredibly poorly paid, especially relative to the qualifications required. So, you know, we really see that from all sides. Really, it's women who have had to shoulder the big gaps, the big deficit in early learning and childcare.
And based on everything that you're saying there, I almost want to say that, you know, the number one thing that keeps coming back is, you know, women are the main, you know, educators in the field of education. You know, we're the main caregivers. And I almost want to point to say that, is it because we're basically fighting generations of societal views to say that care is something that every woman is capable of doing, or not even capable of doing, but it's our destiny to be, you know, the mothers, the caregivers, you know, the nurturers, the providers. And so based on that societal lens, that's is that a factor into why maybe there's not as much respect in this field, or why all those problems that you were saying have arisen?
Well, I mean, it's certainly convenient to perpetuate, for governments and others to perpetuate the systems that rely on the view that women should be the ones who are taking care of young children. There's no question. But, you know, it's interesting. If you look at the history of some other professions, which are caring professions where they have been female-dominated professions, one of the ways to actually change that attitude and actually bring in gender diversity into professions is to pay more. So, you know, you see that, for example, in teaching.
Yeah.
Although elementary teaching, there's still a lot of women in the profession. Through the process of unionization in specifically, and through, you know, real movement to raise the standards of teachers, the qualifications of teachers, but also the professionalization of teachers, we've seen more men enter the profession. So I think that's really, what explains the situation is that it saves a lot of money.
Yes.
Governments save a lot of money, and others save a lot of money by ensuring that the care of children is done by either free labor or cheap labor.
Absolutely.
And everything else follows from that.
So I guess that kind of brings me into my next question. So we know that Quebec is kind of the province that we look to when we talk about affordable childcare. From my understanding, affordable childcare was introduced in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. A bit earlier than that, but yeah, late 90s. The movement started a bit earlier, but yes.
So just before we kind of dive into this, why does Quebec have affordable childcare, and why is it not a federal, but it seems to be more of a provincial push versus something that all Canadians should have? Or is Quebec the only province that we know, that I personally know of, that has affordable childcare?
Yes, I mean, I think the important thing about Quebec is that it's affordable is certainly important, but what is really important about Quebec is that the government at the time made a political choice and a political decision that it would start providing and organizing early learning and childcare as a public service.
Mhm.
and that it would publicly fund the supply of childcare, and it would publicly manage the supply of childcare. And as a result of that decision, this service, or the early childhood education that was made available, was affordable. There are different ways of making childcare affordable.
Mhm.
But what we had in Quebec was not just an issue of affordability. Most importantly, what happened is a government pursued a policy of public funding and public management with respect to the supply of
Okay.
childcare.
Wow.
So you can make childcare affordable or more affordable, for example, by focusing on what we call the demand side, by focusing on the parents
Mhm.
of children, and making the fees more affordable by providing them some subsidies,
Right.
right? And that's what most governments have done, provincial and territorial governments in Canada.
Mhm.
What the Quebec government decided to do was address the issue of affordability, lower the cost to individual families by publicly funding the supply. And that's the key difference. And that's the essential element of the childcare plan and strategy that we're calling for, is that we want childcare to be publicly funded and publicly managed, the supply side. And through properly funding and organizing the supply of childcare, then what governments can do is actually make it available to parents at an affordable cost, or at a fair cost. Then governments can get into separately the decision of, okay, it's going to cost us this much amount of money to make childcare available to everybody.
Right.
Then we can have a discussion about how much should the individual parent who accesses the system contribute to the cost of the provision of childcare. And
Mhm.
then another question governments can say is, if families, if parents should have to pay or something towards the cost of the provision of childcare, how much should it be? Should it be based on individual income? Should it be based on household income? Should it be in the form of paying back the money that the government pays?
Mhm.
And should it be done through the tax system? Or should it be done by actually paying an invoice from the childcare center? But these are separate questions.
Right.
And this is all, this would all be questions that need to be addressed if a government decides to actually design a publicly funded and publicly managed childcare system. But
So,
right now, those debates, until recently, those debates really haven't happened in
right.
a serious public way.
So essentially what we're trying to move is move away from this idea that childcare is, I guess, a luxury item that people should have, and versus or a private, what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, yeah, a
Something
private
private that
benefit,
people
or yeah,
have,
yeah,
versus something public, much like the education system, that should be available to everybody.
yeah, yeah. What we talk about is that right now, for the most part, everywhere in Canada, childcare is treated like a commodity that's bought and sold on a market,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And it's not organized and funded and regarded and treated like it's a public good, a common good, something that should really be paid for collectively and organized in a way that meets collective and broad public policy objectives, as opposed to it just being seen as a private thing.
Right.
You have a kid, it's your problem to figure it out. And you see, it's really contradictory because, as an economy, as a society, we don't do that for everything. So when it comes to children, we don't do that once the child hits 4 or 5 years old, depending on what province or territory you look in. We have public kindergarten programs.
Yes.
And we don't do it for healthcare.
Mhm.
We have rejected several times this notion that healthcare should be available through a voucher system, where we give everybody some money and they go and shop for healthcare. And
Right.
we don't do it because it doesn't work.
Yes.
Because that way, first of all, there's going to be a lot of inequity, but there's going to be a problem of supply.
Yes.
So, and as long as there's a problem with supply, then we have problems of affordability, we have problems of quality, we have problems of inclusion and everything else.
You basically create a domino effect that unless we really got to the root cause, nothing's going to get solved.
Yeah. We don't have a system, so we need to build a system,
Right.
a public system of early childhood education and childcare. And the two should be hand in hand, that it shouldn't just be, it's not about care on the one hand and early childhood education on the other. The two, I mean, as you know, as an ECE, you know that the two are completely integrated.
Absolutely.
You don't separate those two factors, or
No, none at all.
care is education. You can't divide the two.
And that's something that we preach all the time, is to say care will always be a form of education. And a really good friend of mine always said that early childhood education is a basis of child psychology teaching, and it's all wrapped up with love. And that's essentially what we're doing.
Yeah, that's in a high quality program.
Yes.
Of course, there's a lot of poor quality care that really is only care.
Yes.
And one of the big differences between poor quality and high quality is the staff,
I couldn't agree
the
more.
qualifications and the approach of those who are actually working in the sector.
And I think that also brings about sort of kind of coming back to the name changes of the organizations you work with. Why childcare versus daycare? Why are we calling it? Why are we slowly moving from calling it childcare instead of daycare?
Well, when the first sort of shift from daycare to childcare happened, it wasn't that daycare was considered of less value or less important than childcare. It had more to do with the fact that daycare meant that it would be only offered during the day.
Right.
That was one of the reasons for the shift, which now gets forgotten. That there is a sense, what we advocated for, and we did talk about childcare, and there's a lot of discussion and debate within the childcare movement, as there is among ECEs, I'm sure.
Yes.
About what to call it, right? And so, but that was one of the factors why we moved from daycare to childcare, is because our vision of how a publicly funded and publicly managed system would be organized is we wanted to make sure it'd be organized in a way that where a full range of comprehensive programs could be offered. Because we have to understand that the idea of childcare, early learning and childcare, is promoted to serve a number of complementary public policy objectives. So one is obviously the well-being and development of young children.
Yes.
And that is clearly one of the objectives that we have for a comprehensive childcare system. The other is parents need the support. Those who are in the paid labor force and those who are not. Parenting is not something you can do well without support.
Yes.
And of course, without income support, but also without all kinds of other support. I mean, I know as a mother, and particularly later when my youngest was just around 5, I became a single mother. But even when there, was in a household where we were 2 parents, I would not have been able to get through without the support of all those who worked in the childcare center. And those were the staff who worked in the rooms where my kids went, right from infant right up to preschool room. And then even to the school age program, but also the coordinator, the cook, the cleaning staff. Like, it was my whole support network as a parent. And so so it's not only about having access to support so that you can go to work,
Yes.
which was absolutely crucial for me, but it was also the other forms of support. And then, of course, related to the support, particularly for mothers to be able to continue to get paid income and have young children, it's crucial to labor force participation, which is crucial to economic growth and sustainability for everybody. I mean, governments derive a lot of revenue from the income that women earn.
Yes.
And we're seeing that, of course, through the pandemic, as women have been forced out of the paid labor force by the thousands, government revenues have dropped. The economy has shrunk. And the only way that it's going to recover is for women to be able to get back into the paid labor force, and particularly mothers with young kids.
That's a great way of putting it. I kind of want to go back to this idea of Quebec again, just because money does talk to people, and more importantly, I think, especially in my own experience, it really speaks to the men in my family, or that I'm surrounded by. And I think a lot of the times there's a big discrepancy to say we don't need to invest so much in childcare because there should be mothers who should take care of their children, or it's sort of this idea that, well, I have grandparents, or I have aunts and uncles, or I have support system, but without that realization that, like you said, not everybody has, a family support system that's able to say, okay, I will care for your children. And that's wonderful. And that's people who are able to access that are extremely privileged. But again, much like you said, it's not that this is a bad thing, but it's also to say that childcare and education from the pre-kindergarten is also something that should be accessible to all parents. And so I'm curious to know if has there been any research or studies to say that look how positively this has impacted this economy. Has there been any studies to say, or I mean, anywhere around the world that has said having access to quality, affordable childcare has had an amazing positive impact on single parent families, or families who may not have as high a socioeconomic status as others? Or has there been sort of like an equal level playing field for people, with post-secondary versus people without post-secondary?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, there's definitely tons and tons of research that has been done. Lots of research addressing all these questions that you raise. First of all, there's all kinds of research. I mean, it's pretty much undeniable now that if childcare is available and accessible and affordable for mothers with young children, then they will be able to participate in the paid labor force. And the returns on that increase in participation that comes from having a system of accessible, affordable, and inclusive childcare, that increased participation what it does is brings with it higher revenues for governments, but it also has multiplier effects throughout the economy, because it's just sort of basic economics and common sense. If more people are earning money, then more people have disposable income that can actually be spent in other areas of the market, which generates economic activity, right? So that, there are different studies. Yeah, different studies have calculated this in different ways.
Yes.
But in shorthand, for every dollar of public spending on early learning and childcare, the benefits go from $3 to $6, depending on how you make the calculation. And certainly all the research from Quebec shows that the cost of the publicly funded system is more than paid for by the government revenue that comes from increased taxes, income taxes, as a result of the increased participation of women
Wow.
in the paid labor force. And it's funny because in Quebec, um, it wasn't just it hasn't just been the provincial government that has benefited from that raise in tax revenue, but the federal government as well, because of course every worker in Quebec pays Quebec income tax and federal income tax.
Absolutely.
So there are also all kinds of studies that have looked at the question of social and economic inclusion and inclusion. And one of the reasons, I mean, again, there's different approaches to how childcare can be organized. And, you know, several decades ago, the predominant view of childcare and public funding of childcare is that it should be targeted to low income families.
Right.
That, you know, yes, we need to help out. Government, you know, government funds should be given, but it was targeted, and this is still mostly the case, that a lot of the public funding is targeted towards low income families to help them pay the fees.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what we know is that doesn't deal with the problem of supply. That you know, it hasn't, that approach to funding childcare has not resulted in a huge expansion in supply.
Right.
And the other is that it just has never been enough to actually make a huge difference within, you know, with respect to equity, economic equity between households, because there just, you know, there hasn't been, it's not, first of all, it's not a good way to fund, but also it's never resulted in proper funding. And honestly, that in part has to do with there's never been overwhelming strong public support for welfare programs. And so if funding of childcare is looked at as funding a welfare program, you're not going to get the broad public buy-in that you need to actually fund childcare to the extent that it needs to be funded. So what we say is, you know, the problem with programs for the poor is they make for poor programs because they don't enjoy. And so this is why we stress so much the concept of universality.
Right.
What we say is, just like the public education system, just like the health education system, it should be designed so that it doesn't matter what your economic and your social or other status is. You should have complete, full access to the program. And it has to be designed that way. If you design childcare for the poor, then that's not going to happen. And what you're going to have is segregation, and you're going to have racial segregation and all kinds of other forms of segregation in the system. And that's the worst thing for children. It's the worst thing for our society. It's the worst thing for this view that to actually be able to get the best returns, right? You really need a universal inclusive approach, that everybody has an opportunity to benefit from the best and the highest quality programs. So that's why we've always insisted on universality as being a fundamental principle of system design.
So in a sense, it's almost like this universality that comes with childcare is also, in a sense, a social justice issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's an economic issue. It's a social justice issue. Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, just as a parent, anecdotally, as I've seen that, you know, where you have, which we don't have much of, but in some programs where you really do have a coming together in the childcare center, or in the, you know, or in the case of a home provider, where you have kids literally from all walks of life,
Yes,
you end up with better programs.
absolutely.
Right? And kids end up with a richer and better experience, better social skills, better sense of, you know, we're just developing better citizens by taking that approach, than teaching them that somehow a program is going to be limited, you know, by by circumstance, you know,
Right.
by where you live, how much money your parents make, and so forth.
So then I almost want to say then that investing in children now from a young age, does that mean that we are investing less later in life, let's say in prisons or rehabilitation programs, or those sorts of programs that sometimes are needed in the community? Does that kind of come down when we invest in all children, regardless of background, from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, studies that have shown that, you know, the, the best start in life increases your chances of having the best life.
Yes.
Um, and there's certainly lots of studies that support that position. I think where it becomes dangerous is to say that children who don't go to high quality programs are going to end up in prison.
Right.
It's always complicated. Um,
Yes.
you
And you
know,
never want to make
race has much more is a huge factor in whether one ends up in prison or not, right?
absolutely.
Now, of course, it's complicated because race is also a barrier for being able to access high quality inclusive programs,
It is also,
you know,
it is
because
very
it's also related to household income and so forth. So it's complicated.
yeah.
But I mean, certainly it's, you know, needs, we have to think about early childhood education and childcare is as crucial to, and it's really, and I think this is why it's so interesting that the pandemic has, I think, brought about such a broad consensus on this being a good place and thing for governments to spend money on.
Mhm.
Because, you know, when money is short and when governments have to choose carefully, and in particular in this situation of a public health crisis, where should we be spending money? Well, they have to look to spend money in areas that are going to help the economic recovery. They
Mhm.
are going to have to put money into addressing the employment, increasing the employment, paid employment of women, because women have been so dramatically impacted by the pandemic. And, you know, spending on childcare checks many boxes.
Yes.
So it's that's one of the reasons I think it really is so high in the agenda.
So basically, affordable childcare would be a crucial factor towards economic recovery. And unless we really make that known now, we're not going to reach economic recovery to the extent that we need to in order to really get out of all the effects of what have happened in the last not even year.
Yeah. And we just have to be really clear that it's not just about making sure childcare is affordable or the cost is less to parents. That is absolutely critical. But we also have to make sure that the spending is done well,
Mhm.
and that also that this is an opportunity not just to make childcare more affordable, to actually build a system of high quality childcare that is also affordable, that is also accessible. We have to do the design right. I think this is going to be this is really what's going to be important over the next, because I think there's pretty broad consensus
Yes.
that money will be spent on childcare. Now the big question is, how is it going to be spent, and how do we make sure that the money is spent well,
Mhm.
and that we actually make transformative change in what parents experience right now in terms of access and affordability, also what children experience
Mhm.
in the care that they're getting. And also we have to do it right to actually get all these economic benefits that governments are going to be counting on.
Right.
Um, there's only a certain kind of way to design the system that's going to give you those economic returns that everybody's counting on, especially now.
Yes. And so kind of that goes into my next question. So what are there political parties that are supporting the Affordable Child Care Plan? We know of one that Sharon spoke of here in BC. But again, this is provincial. But now if we're talking about if we go into another federal, or when we go into another federal election, not if, but which political party does support affordable childcare, or even how have past government policies impacted the road towards affordable childcare?
Well, I'll speak just at the federal level,
Mhm.
is that there have been there have been a couple of times through history federally where federal governments have actually said, yeah, we want to do something about childcare.
Mhm.
But the approach, for the most part, as I said, has been patchwork. And of course, we had the 10 years when Stephen Harper was the prime minister and the Conservatives were in power, where they said they were going to do something about childcare, and they actually introduced a childcare allowance. But their idea of doing something about childcare was to give cash to parents and tell them, to go
Figure it out
spend
yourself.
it on childcare, spend it on whatever, they wanted to spend the money on. But
Right,
that was their childcare program.
right.
I think what we have right now is a much better and different understanding on the part of the federal Liberal government about what's needed.
Right.
I'm encouraged by the recent throne speech, because the throne speech spoke about this is the time to actually build a Canada-wide system. So as
Yeah.
soon as I hear system, I think, okay, that's promising.
Yes.
Um, and in the past, we've heard promises of spaces. We're going to create X number of spaces. Creating spaces, that's not building a system.
No,
Building a system is a very different thing than creating spaces.
it kind of goes
Um,
back to the Band-Aid effect.
exactly. And the other thing that I was excited about in the throne speech is the recognition that this was going to require federal leadership. And that's something that we've always said,
Yes.
that the problem with leaving it up to provinces is you get into a situation like we did, that one province addresses the issue in the 90s, and then no other province except more recently British Columbia. That's many years in between
Yeah.
where we've not seen a system building. But if you have a federal government that puts system building at the top of its agenda and then puts money to it, then we have a much better chance of actually getting system building happening across the country. So that was exciting to me, that in the throne speech, the federal Liberal government talked about sustained, significant long-term funding. So that was really good. And they also said with the objective of making childcare accessible to all,
Amazing.
which implies affordable, and
Yes.
it also implies that it's going to be inclusive.
Yep.
And they have certainly spoken about quality. And the NDP federally, in the 2019, so we put forward our plan, our federal plan for how to make childcare, how to build a universal system, and we called for federal leadership and a number of other things. The NDP endorsed it completely, fully, including our monetary ask. The Liberals in the 2019 election did adopt parts of it. But I would say that they've moved from 2019 to today. They've taken some big steps towards the kind of system building that we'd like to see. And
Okay.
then the Green Party federally was also not as clear as the NDP in its support of our plan, but generally in support of it. So we have a situation, we have 3 national parties of 4
Yes.
who really support in principle. Now, since the pandemic, our financial ask of the federal government has doubled,
Of course.
which exactly,
Yeah. That's a
understandably,
given.
it has to.
Yeah.
The sector has been decimated. We don't have, in fact, the collection of data is so poor in this sector that we can't actually say exactly what's happening at any given time in the childcare sector. But there's certainly some provinces where, only half what was available, half the childcare, licensed childcare I'm talking about, that was available to families before the pandemic is still available. And of course, it's not affordable. So even where it's available, because families have taken such a big economic hit during the pandemic, it's even less affordable now than it was before the pandemic. So we have a lot of catching up to do. We have a lot of repair, recovery to do. So we need money for that.
Yes.
But also we need to accelerate the system building.
Absolutely.
So we have a little bit of work to do with the NDP federally on that.
Yeah.
They're still at the 2019 commitment, which was what we were asking for. They agreed with us. We've doubled. We need to see them also double their ask of the Liberal government, but I'm sure that will come.
Yes.
And we'll see what happens in probably next month in the federal economic statement and in the next budget.
Amazing. So that brings me to my last question then. Does then that mean, would it be safe to say that, does the lack of affordable childcare and safe spaces for children here in Canada mean that we are in direct violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child?
Our view is that the Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Child entitle a child to access to high quality education, and that Canada, under that convention and its agreement to that convention, really has to deliver on fulfillment of that right. And in fact, we really support this rights-based approach. That it isn't just about we should do it because it's good for the economy. We shouldn't only do it because parents need it, but because every child has the right to the highest quality education and care. That is really a fundamental piece of it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Morna. This has been an amazing chat. I have learned so much that I did not know about, especially on the federal level. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak to me and to also speak to the audience and the listeners so that we can educate ourselves more on what it is, what the Affordable Childcare Plan is, why it's important and why it's necessary and why it's essential.
Well, it's been a delight. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. Before we sign off, are there any resources that you would like to let our audience know so that they can do their own research?
Well, what I would love to do is tell people to go to our website or our Facebook page. Our website is timeforchildcare.ca. We also have a campaign website, which is really important for people to go to. If they support our plan, if they want to express that support, they can endorse it on a campaign website, childcareforall.ca, all one word, childcareforall.ca. And just search us on Facebook. And we try through our website and our Facebook to post all kinds of resources for people, and they can ask questions and engage. And of course, we want to also really encourage the BC listeners of your show to support the $10 a day program and to support the advocacy, the incredible advocacy work that is being done in your province. And I don't know when this podcast is being aired, but please get out and vote for childcare.
We're going to air right before the provincial election. So here's
Great.
hoping.
Great. What you do in BC is obviously critical to your province, to the future of your province, to the children in your province, to the parents, to your own economy. But it's also really important to the rest of Canada. Because if the BC NDP government, after the throne speech, welcomed the federal government's interest and welcomed the promise of sustained funding. And this, to build a Canada-wide childcare system, it has to be a cooperative and collective level by different levels of government. So it's really important to have eager, willing provincial partners in the project. And the NDP has certainly been that. And but that would be a really important question to ask candidates. When they visit or phone. I guess maybe they only Zoom now to campaign through election. Is where do they stand on childcare?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to say thank you to the audience for listening to this week's episode of ECE Honestly. If you have any questions or comments, you can always feel free to send us an email at ecehonestly@gmail.com. Of course, you can always DM us on our Instagram page, which is @ECE Honestly, or you can find us on Facebook, again at ECE Honestly, or you can like, comment, and subscribe to this video. We, again, thank you so much, Morna, for all your information and all of your knowledge. And Lisa and I are super excited to also share any resources to the audience that do with the Affordable Childcare Plan.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.